My husband died 3 months ago. Last night, my security camera sent me a notification that said known person at the door, and the face on my screen was his. I want you to understand what that feels like. Not the fear, although there was fear. Not the confusion, although there was plenty of that too. I want you to understand the specific, total disorientation of being 3 months into the hardest grief of your life, lying in a bed that still smells like someone who is gone, and picking up your phone at 11:47 at night to see your dead husband's face looking back at you from your own front porch. The camera had recognized him, not flagged him as an unknown, not triggered the motion alert. The facial recognition software, the software I had programmed with photographs of family members when we installed the system 2 years ago, had looked at the face on that porch and said, "I know this person. I know him." It called him by name. If you are listening to this right now, I need you to stay with me, because what I found when I opened that door and what I found in the weeks that followed is not a ghost story. I want to tell you that immediately because I know how this starts and I know what it sounds like, and I need you to understand that what I am about to tell you is not supernatural. It is something considerably more disturbing than supernatural, because supernatural things cannot hurt you the way human beings can. What I found was a scam, a deliberate, constructed 20-year scam, one that my husband had been running or running adjacent to or was a victim of, or some combination of all three that I am still, even now, trying to fully map. And before I go any further, tell me in the comments where you are listening from right now. Are you someone who has lost a person and is living in the specific unreality of grief, where nothing feels solid and the world keeps moving while you are standing completely still? Are you someone who has discovered that a person they loved was not exactly who they believed? I read every comment. Everyone, because this story belongs to anyone who has ever had the ground pulled out from under them twice, once by death and once by the truth that death was hiding. Let me start at the beginning, not 11:47 at night, not the notification, all the way back to the marriage, to the man, to the 20 years I thought I understood and the 20 years I apparently did not. Act 1. The marriage, 2:30 to 11 o'clock. His name was Thomas Ellery Voss. Tom. He was 56 years old when he died, or when I was told he died, which I now understand is a different statement, though for the first 3 months of my grief I did not know they were different statements at all. Tom was a financial consultant. That was the title on his business cards and on his LinkedIn profile. And in the brief, careful biography that appeared in the obituary, I spent 4 hours writing at my kitchen table while my sister sat across from me and refilled my coffee and did not know what to say. Financial consultant. It is a title that means many things, which is part of its utility. It is broad enough to cover a range of activities without being specific enough to require detailed explanation. I understood in the general way of a spouse who trusts and therefore does not interrogate that Tom helped individuals and small businesses manage investments, plan for retirement, navigate the particular complexity of making money grow without losing it to the thousand things that can go wrong. He was good at it. We lived well. Not extravagantly. Tom was careful with money in the way of someone who understands it deeply, or in the way of someone who is managing several different versions of it simultaneously and needs the visible version to look unremarkable. I did not know then which one it was. We met when I was 31 and he was 34. I was teaching high school history. I still do. I am still a teacher. It is one of the things that kept me upright during the 3 months of grief before the notification. And he was at a community event I attended with a friend who knew someone who knew someone. He was confident without being loud, which I always find more compelling than the alternative. He asked good questions. He listened to the answers. He had a way of making a conversation feel like something that was happening only for the two people in it, which is a gift and, as I now understand, also a skill that can be cultivated deliberately. I did not know the difference at the time. I was 31, and he made me feel like the most interesting person in the room. That is a powerful thing to feel. We married 2 years later. We built what I can only describe from the inside of it as a genuinely good life. A house, a dog eventually, 2 dogs, friends we saw regularly, dinners that went late and became the kind of evenings people talk about on the drive home. Travel. Tom loved to travel, and looking back, I can see the trips through a different lens now, understand why certain destinations were chosen, and why we always seemed to stay in places that were adjacent to the main tourist infrastructure rather than in the center of it, why he sometimes disappeared for an afternoon in a city we were supposedly exploring together, and came back with a plausible explanation and a small gift and that specific, slightly too casual energy of someone who has just finished something. I saw it then, registered it then, filed it in the drawer that spouses keep for things they notice and choose not to examine because examination feels like an accusation, and accusation feels like the end of something you are not ready to end. We did not have children. This was a choice that evolved rather than one we made deliberately. The years passed and circumstances shifted, and eventually we understood that it was not going to happen, and we made our peace with it. I made my peace with it. Tom said he had. I believed him. I believe many things that I am now holding up to the light and turning slowly, looking for what is true and what was performed. He died on a Tuesday in February. Heart attack, the doctor said. Sudden, total, no warning signs that had been identified or communicated. He had been at a work meeting, a client dinner, his assistant confirmed, though I have since asked questions about that assistant and received answers that raised more questions, which is a pattern I have become familiar with. He collapsed in the restaurant parking lot. By the time the ambulance arrived, he was gone. I identified the body. I want to say that clearly because it becomes relevant later. I stood in a room with fluorescent lighting, and I looked at a face I had been looking at for 22 years, and I said, yes, that is my husband. And I believed it completely, the way you believe something when the alternative is incomprehensible. I planned the funeral. I wrote the obituary. I stood at the graveside in February cold and received the condolences of people who loved him or who loved the version of him they knew. And I went home and I tried to figure out how to be a person in a world that he was no longer in. For 3 months, that is what I did. And then my phone lit up at 11:47 at night. I had not been sleeping well. This is not unusual for grief. Sleep and grief have a complicated relationship, one that therapists and physicians have documented extensively, and that I can now confirm from personal experience is every bit as difficult as described. I was awake when the notification came, lying in the dark, not sleeping, doing the thing grieving people do at midnight, which is think about everything that cannot be changed, and everything that was not said, and everything that will never be said now. My phone was on the nightstand. It buzzed. I looked at it. The security system app, the little camera icon, and below it, the words that our system uses when it identifies a face it has been taught to recognize. Known person at the door, Thomas Voss. I stared at it for what might have been 30 seconds or might have been 3 minutes. Time does something strange in moments of shock. It becomes unreliable, uneven, more like weather than like a clock. I looked at the notification. I looked at the small thumbnail image attached to it, a figure on the porch, dark, grainy, the specific low resolution of a night vision camera doing its best. I pressed the button to see the live feed. The porch was empty. Whatever, whoever had been there was gone. I got up. I know that this was not the safest thing to do. I know that any rational assessment of the situation would suggest that a person alone in a house at midnight who sees an unaccountable figure on their porch should not go downstairs and investigate independently. I know this. I am a high school history teacher who has read enough about what happens to people who make that choice in stories to understand its risks. I went anyway, because grief does something to the calculus of self-preservation. When you have already lost the thing you most feared losing, the category of things that frighten you reorganizes itself in strange ways. I went downstairs. I turned on the porch light. I looked through the glass panel beside the door for a long moment. Nothing. No one. Just the porch and the dark street beyond it, and two moths reconvening around the light the way they always do. I opened the door. The porch was empty, but on the doormat, on the exact center of the doormat, placed with a deliberateness that did not suggest accident, was an envelope, white, letter-sized, unsealed, my name on the front. Not a printed label. Handwriting. Tom's handwriting. I stood in the doorway for a moment with the cold night air coming around me, and then I picked it up, and then I opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper, a note, 7 words handwritten, and then a sentence below them. The 7 words, "The coffin was empty. I am sorry." The sentence, "Look under the floorboards in the study. You deserve the truth." I sat down on the porch step in my pajamas in February, and I held that piece of paper, and I understood, in the way you understand things that your mind has not yet caught up to, but your body already knows, that the 3 months I had just lived through were going to require a complete reconstruction, that what I had buried was not what I thought, that the life I had been grieving was not the life I had actually lived. And then I went inside. I locked the door, I went to the study, and I lifted the 3rd floorboard from the left, the one that always had a slight give to it that Tom always said he would fix and never did, the one I had stopped noticing because couples stop noticing the small imperfections of shared space. They become part of the texture of a life. I lifted it up, and underneath it, I found a metal box. The box was fireproof, gray, rectangular, the kind sold at hardware stores for document storage. It had a combination lock. I did not know the combination. I knew Tom's combinations. That is the thing about 22 years. You accumulate the small codes of a person. His gym locker, his bicycle lock when he still had a bicycle, his briefcase years ago before briefcases gave way to laptop bags. I tried them all. None of them worked. I tried our anniversary, our wedding date forwards and backwards, his mother's birthday, the year we met, the address of our first apartment. None of them. I tried the date he died. The box opened. I'm going to tell you what was inside, but I want to prepare you first, not for drama, but because the contents require some organization to make sense of, and I have spent considerable time since that night organizing them with help so that I can tell you what they mean in a way that is accurate. There were documents, many documents, papers I did not recognize, account statements from institutions I had never heard of under names that were not Tom's name, or not the Tom Voss name I knew. There were 3 passports. One was the passport I knew, the blue American one with his photograph and the stamps from our travels, the one that should have been in the drawer in the bedroom, which means the one in the drawer was something else. The other 2 were from different countries, different names, same face. There was a notebook, small, leather, the kind Tom always carried and always said was for client notes, and which I had never opened, because you do not open your spouse's work notebooks. It does not occur to you to do so. You trust them. I opened it now. The handwriting was Tom's. The contents were... Let me find the right word. The contents were a map a map of something that had been constructed over a very long time, accounts and transfers and names and dates and the specific shorthand of someone tracking something complex across multiple jurisdictions. There were photographs, people I did not recognize, in places I did not recognize, with Tom in the center of several of them. Tom smiling, Tom shaking hands, Tom at tables in restaurants that were not the restaurants of our life together. And there was a letter, longer than the note on the doormat, written in several pages in that same handwriting that I had been looking at for 22 years on grocery lists and birthday cards and the occasional note left on the kitchen counter when he left early and didn't want to wake me. The letter started, "Miriam, if you are reading this, something has gone wrong, or something has finally gone right, depending on how you look at it. I owe you more than this letter. I have owed you more than this letter for 20 years, but this is what I have, so let me try." His name was not originally Thomas Ellery Foss. I'm going to tell you what the letter said, not word for word. It was 11 pages, and some of it was specific and technical in ways that took weeks of subsequent investigation to fully decode, but the shape of it, the outline of the 20 years. Tom's real name, the name he was born with, the name that appears on a birth certificate in a state I will not specify because there are proceedings still ongoing, was not Tom Voss. He had taken that name with documentation that was fraudulent but convincingly constructed approximately 23 years ago, before we met. 1 year before we met, which means the man I fell in love with at 31 was already at the point of our first conversation a constructed identity. Everything I knew about his childhood, his family, his history, the parents he said had died young, the older brother he said he'd lost touch with, the hometown he described with the specific nostalgic detail of someone who has rehearsed it, was a story. A well-built story maintained for 22 years without a structural failure, until the night a piece of paper appeared on my doormat. The real story, as best as I have been able to reconstruct with the help of people I will tell you about shortly, is this.
He had been involved in his mid-20s in a financial fraud. Not as the architect of it. This is the part I have turned over many times, looking at it from different angles, because it matters to me, even if it should not, even if I know that what matters legally and morally is the involvement itself and not its degree. From everything I have been able to determine, he was not the architect. He was recruited. A young man who was good with numbers and was impressed by older men who seemed to understand money in ways he didn't yet, and who made him feel that what they were doing was sophisticated rather than criminal. The fraud was significant. It involved an investment scheme that collapsed and took a number of people's savings with it. When it collapsed, several people went to prison. Tom, the person who would become Tom, did not, because by the time the collapse happened, he had already understood what was coming. He had taken what he had access to, and he had built a door, and he had walked through it into a different name and a different life. He felt guilty. The letter says this many times in many ways, and I've had to make my own determination about whether guilt stated after the fact is genuine, or whether it is the performance of guilt, which is different. I have not fully resolved that question. I am not sure I will. What I know is that for 22 years, he built a quiet, unremarkable, carefully bounded life with me. He did not take large risks. He did not accumulate extraordinary wealth. He was, by the measures available to me, a faithful husband and a reliable presence and a person who showed up for the daily work of a life with consistency. He was also a person who was living inside a false name, with a past that could unravel everything if it caught up, and who had made the decision, a decision I was not part of, that I was not given the chance to make, that I would live inside that untruth with him. That is the part I keep coming back to, the decision on my behalf that I did not get to make, the 22 years of choosing every morning to continue to wake up beside me and answer to Tom and maintain the story and let me build my life on a foundation that he knew and I did not know was built on something else. That is not a single act. That is a sustained, daily, deliberate choice. And whatever else I understand or forgive or release, that particular thing, the weight of it, the accumulated 22 years of it, that I am still sitting with. The letter explained the coffin. This is the part people ask about most, and it is the part I find most difficult to hold because it required planning, considerable, deliberate pre-mortem planning. Someone had found him, not law enforcement. The statute of limitations on the original fraud had long since passed. Someone from that original world, that original scheme, who had apparently spent a great deal of time locating him and had, upon locating him, made contact. Tom's letter does not name this person directly. He uses a designation, a letter, and I will respect that because the investigation is ongoing. This person had leverage, documented, provable leverage that connected Tom's real identity to the original fraud and that would, if revealed, destroy everything we had built. And this person wanted something in return for silence. Tom had decided, rather than comply with what was being demanded or watch everything collapse, to disappear again, to do what he had done 23 years ago, build a door and walk through it. But this time the door required a death certificate, a funeral, a closed casket that the letter confirmed contained weight and documentation and nothing else, a paid co-conspirator in the funeral home industry that I will let the appropriate authorities name when they are ready, and a plan to eventually, when enough time had passed, when the person with the leverage believed the threat was gone, to contact me. A note on a doormat, 7 words, after 3 months of grief that I lived fully and completely and without any knowledge that it was not what it appeared to be. I do not have words adequate to that. I have sat with it for weeks and I do not have words. I did not call Tom. There was no number in the letter. There was no instruction about how to reach him. The letter said he would be in contact when it was safe, when he had resolved the situation, when he knew what came next. I am a high school history teacher. I am not a private investigator or a law enforcement officer or a person with any particular experience navigating fraud or missing persons or the intersection of faked deaths and legitimate grief. What I am is a person who has spent 30 years teaching young people how to research something, how to ask the right questions, how to follow a source to its origin and evaluate what they find. I applied those skills. I applied them with the specific focus of someone who has been handed an 11-page letter and told their life was not what it appeared to be, and has decided that sitting and waiting for a man who has already made all the decisions without her is not the posture she is willing to adopt. I called my sister first. Not immediately. I sat with the box and the letter until 4 a.m., reading and rereading and looking at the photographs and the notebook and the 3 passports. And then at 4 a.m., I called my sister, who is 2 years older than me and is the most practically competent person I know, and I said, I need you to come over. I need to tell you something, and I need you to help me think. She was at my door by 5:30. She read the letter. She looked at the documents. She said in a voice that was very steady and very careful, okay, here is what we are going to do. We contacted an attorney. Specifically an attorney who specializes in fraud. My sister found her, a woman named Delphine who had handled complex financial deception cases for 20 years, and she sat across from me in her office 4 days after the notification and read through the documents with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who has seen versions of this before and is now calibrating exactly how this version differs. She said, "This is real, and this is serious, and there are several things that need to happen in a specific order." She told me what they were. We contacted the FBI. I want to say that clearly because I think people assume there is a version of this story where I protected Tom, where I received the information and absorbed it and waited for him to come back on his own terms and made my decisions in private. That is not what I did. I did not feel after 3 months of genuine grief over a death that was staged a particular obligation to protect the choices of the person who had staged it. I felt an obligation to truth.
My mother was a truth-telling woman. My grandmother was a truth-telling woman. I was raised in a house where the most serious thing you could be accused of was not failure or error, but dishonesty, the deliberate construction of a false picture for someone who deserved a real one. I could not hold what I knew and do nothing with it. It was not in me. The FBI were, as you might imagine, interested. A faked death involves a number of federal statutes. The original fraud, even with expired statutes, provided context. The person Tom had identified in his letter, using only a letter, but a letter that combined with the other documents in the box gave investigators enough to work with. That person was a thread that, when pulled, led to other threads. I will not tell you where that investigation currently stands because it is ongoing, and I have been asked not to, and I have learned in the last several months the value of doing what I am asked by people who know more than I do about the situation I am inside. Tom surfaced, not at my door again, through his attorney, who contacted Delphine 6 weeks after the notification. He was alive and in a place I will not name. He had apparently resolved or neutralized the threat from the person with leverage, at least sufficiently to make contact possible. His attorney communicated that he wished to speak with me, that he wanted to explain, that he understood if I refused. I did not refuse, because I am a person who believes in the complete picture, even when the complete picture is damaging, because I had questions that a letter and a metal box had not fully answered, and because 22 years, even reconstructed, even reassessed, even viewed through the lens of what I now knew, 22 years is not nothing. It does not disappear. It sits in you, changed but present, demanding to be looked at honestly rather than simply discarded. We spoke by video call, once, for 2 hours. I will not share the contents of that call in detail, not because they are unimportant, but because they are mine. They belong to the private part of this, the part that does not become a story because it is too specifically personal to be shared without cost. What I will tell you is this. He was genuine in the way I recognized and had always recognized, and I do not know what to do with that. That the genuineness of a person does not cancel the wrongness of what they did, and the wrongness of what they did does not erase 22 years of genuine. Both things are true simultaneously, and I am learning to hold them both without resolving them into something simpler, because they are not simple and they do not want to be resolved. I told him what I had done. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I know you would. I was counting on it." I said, "You were counting on me turning you in?" He said, "I was counting on you doing the right thing because that is who you are, and because some part of me knew when I wrote that letter and put that box under the floor that the only way I was ever going to come out of this on the other side of something I could live with was if someone who couldn't be compromised knew the truth. You can't be compromised, Miriam. You never could be. It was one of the things He stopped. He said, "It was one of the things." He did not finish the sentence. I did not ask him to. I am still a high school history teacher. I walk into a classroom every morning and I teach young people about the past, about the way events that seem finished are never quite finished, about the long arcs of consequence, about the way that truth, suppressed or hidden or buried in a metal box under a floorboard, has a tendency to surface. I teach this, and I know it more personally now than I did before, and I am not sure, but I think it makes me better at it. My house is still my house. The floorboard has been repaired. The box and its contents are with Delphine and the appropriate authorities. The security camera is still on the porch. I have looked at it differently since February, not with fear, but with a kind of respect for what it did. It recognized a face. It sent a notification. It did not know it was unraveling a 20-year architecture of concealment. It just knew the face. There is something in that, I think, that is worth sitting with. We construct our stories carefully. We build them over years with attention and effort and the accumulated detail that make a fiction feel like a fact. We lay floorboards over the boxes we do not want found. We carry passports with different names. We maintain with tremendous daily effort the version of ourselves that we have decided other people should know. And then a camera recognizes a face. And then truth, which has been waiting patiently under the floorboards, surfaces. I am not a believer in destiny. I am a history teacher. I deal in cause and effect, in the decisions of human beings and their consequences, in the way that choices accumulate into outcomes that can seem inevitable in retrospect and were not inevitable at all. Tom made choices. Every day for 22 years, he made a choice. I was not given that choice. That is the wound that I am tending most carefully, the one that will take the longest to close, the one that is most specifically mine. But I also believe, and I say this not as comfort, not as resolution, but as something I have arrived at honestly after sitting in the dark with it for many months, I believe that truth has a gravitational pull, that the things we most carefully bury are the things most drawn toward the surface, that the effort required to maintain a constructed life is in some sense the mechanism of its own undoing, because it requires concealment, and concealment requires choosing, and choosing is something you do over and over again. And eventually, a camera sees a face, and a notification arrives, and someone is awake in the dark at 11:47 at night and picks up their phone. I picked up my phone. I went downstairs. I opened the door. I found what was there. That is what I keep coming back to in the end. Not the fraud, not the passports, not the 11 pages of a letter from a man I thought was dead. I keep coming back to the moment I stood in the doorway in my pajamas in February and made the decision to look at what was on the other side of the door, to not close the app and put the phone down and decide it was a glitch, a mistake, a system error, to not protect myself from what I was about to find by pretending it wasn't there. I looked. I found. I told the truth about what I found. That is the thing I am most certain I did right. In a situation with very few clear rights and many complicated wrongs, that is the one I hold on to. I did not close the door. If you are listening to this right now and there is something in your life, something you have been walking past, filing away, choosing not to examine because examination feels like a door you are not sure you want to open, I want to say this gently but completely. Open it anyway. Not because what is on the other side will be easy. It won't. Not because the truth always arrives cleanly. It doesn't. But because the alternative, a life built on something you chose not to look at, costs more in the end than the looking does. And because you deserve to know what is true about your own life, even when the truth is 11 pages in the handwriting of someone you thought you knew, even when the truth is in a metal box under a floorboard, even when the truth arrives in a notification at 11:47 at night and says, in the language of technology doing its simple and faithful job, known person at the door, look. Thank you fully, genuinely, for staying with me through every single word of this. If this story reached somewhere real in you, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and leave me a comment. Tell me where you are listening from. Tell me about the door you have been standing in front of. Tell me what you found when you opened it. I will be reading. I always am.